The mahogany table stretched before me like a battlefield, its polished surface reflecting the pale afternoon light filtering through the law office windows. I sat at the far end, my hands folded in my lap, trying to make myself as small as possible, while the weight of 23 years of disappointment pressed down on my shoulders. The familiar scent of old leather and legal documents filled the air, mixing with my mother's expensive perfume, a fragrance that had always made me feel inadequate, like I was somehow trespassing in her world of carefully curated elegance. My sister Catherine sat directly across from me, her designer handbag placed strategically on the table, her manicured fingers drumming impatiently against its surface. She had that look, the one that said she belonged here, that she deserved whatever was coming. Her auburn hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless despite the early hour, and she wore the black dress that had cost more than my rent for 2 months. Everything about her screamed success, achievement, worthiness. Mother sat beside her, ramrod straight in her chair, her silver hair pulled back in the severe bun she'd worn to every important occasion for as long as I could remember. Her blue eyes, once warm when I was a child, now held nothing but cold calculation as they swept over me. She had dressed for the occasion, too, a charcoal gray suit that spoke of authority and control, the kind of outfit that made boardrooms listen and bank managers approve loans without question. I tugged at the hem of my modest black skirt, the one I'd bought at a discount store 3 years ago, and had worn to every funeral, job interview, and formal occasion since. The fabric had begun to pill at the edges, and I'd spent 20 minutes that morning with a razor, trying to make it presentable. My shoes were comfortable but uninspiring, chosen for their practicality rather than their style. Everything about me whispered apology, inadequacy, the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, I might finally be enough. Harold Winters, the family attorney, cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. He was a man who had grown old in the service of other people's secrets, his face a map of diplomatic silences and carefully worded truths. His office walls were lined with law books that looked as though they had been consulted regularly, their spines worn smooth by decades of use. A single photograph sat on his desk, his late wife, smiling in a garden somewhere, surrounded by roses that had probably been blooming for 40 years. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying the weight of ritual and reverence. "We are here today to read the last will and testament of Harold Benjamin Morrison, your grandfather and great-grandfather, who passed away peacefully on November 15th of this year. Grandfather," the word caught in my throat like a fishbone. Harold Benjamin Morrison had been the one constant in my childhood, the steady presence who had taught me to identify birds by their songs and stars by their positions. He had been the one who listened when I talked about books, who encouraged my dreams of becoming a writer, who told me stories about his own youth that made me believe in the possibility of adventure and meaning. He had also been the one who had grown increasingly distant over the past 5 years, his phone calls becoming less frequent, his visits to our family gatherings marked by a sadness I couldn't understand. Mother had explained it away as his advancing age, his growing confusion, but I had seen the way his eyes sought mine across crowded rooms, the way he seemed to be trying to tell me something he couldn't quite say. Harold was a man of considerable means, Mr. Winters continued, shuffling through the papers before him. He built his fortune through careful investments in real estate and manufacturing, and he was known throughout the community for his generosity and his commitment to family values. I felt Mother's presence beside me like a radiating heat source, her satisfaction practically humming through the air. She had always been Grandfather's favorite, the daughter who had married well, who had raised successful children, who had never caused him worry or embarrassment. She had been the one to manage his affairs in his final years, The one who had convinced him to move to the assisted living facility when his memory began to fail. The one who had made all the difficult decisions with the authority of someone who had never doubted her right to make them. The estate consists of the family home at 412 Maple Street, valued at approximately $800,000, investment portfolios worth roughly $2.3 million, and various personal effects including a collection of vintage automobiles and Swiss timepieces. My stomach clenched. Those were numbers that belonged in other people's lives, the kind of money that could pay off student loans and credit card debt and maybe, just maybe, buy a small house somewhere quiet where I could finally write the novel I had been carrying around in my head for the past 10 years. But I knew better than to hope. I had learned long ago that hope was a luxury I couldn't afford. The primary beneficiary of Harold Morrison's estate is his daughter, Margaret Morrison Blackwood, Mr. Winters announced, and I felt the familiar sting of invisibility. Of course, it had always been about Mother, about her needs and her desires, and her perfectly orchestrated life. Mrs. Morrison Blackwood will inherit the family home and the majority of the investment portfolio, valued at approximately $1.8 million. Mother's hand reached across the table and squeezed Catherine's fingers. They exchanged a look of mutual satisfaction, a silent communication that spoke of shared expectations fulfilled and futures secured. I had seen that look 1,000 times before. At Christmas mornings when Catherine's presence overshadowed mine. At graduation ceremonies where Catherine's achievements were celebrated while mine were barely acknowledged. At family dinners where Catherine's career updates were met with enthusiasm, while my struggles were met with polite indifference. Catherine Morrison Blackwood will inherit the remaining investment portfolio, valued at approximately $400,000, as well as her great-grandfather's collection of vintage automobiles. Catherine smiled, a genuine expression of joy that transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. She had always loved those cars, had spent summer afternoons with grandfather learning about engines and restoration, had driven them to her high school prom and her college graduation. She deserved them, I told myself. She had earned them through attention and interest, and the kind of enthusiastic participation that I had never quite managed to achieve. And finally, Mr. Winters continued, his voice taking on a slightly different tone. Emily Morrison will inherit the Swiss timepiece collection, valued at approximately $50,000. $50,000. The number echoed in my mind like a prayer answered, like a door opening in a wall I had thought was solid. It wasn't life-changing money, not compared to what Mother and Catherine were receiving. But it was more than I had ever dared to hope for. It was enough to pay off my student loans, enough to buy a reliable car, enough to maybe take a year off from the 3 part-time jobs that were slowly grinding me down, and finally finish the novel that had been whispering in my head for so long. But even as gratitude began to bloom in my chest, I heard Mother's voice, low and venomous, directed at me alone. "You don't deserve anything." The words hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs and the hope from my heart. She leaned closer, her breath warm against my ear, her voice pitched so low that Mr. Winters couldn't hear her over the rustling of papers. "You think $50,000 makes you special? You think it erases 23 years of disappointment?" I wanted to respond, wanted to defend myself, wanted to point out that I had never asked for anything, that I had never expected anything, that I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove that I was worth something, anything, to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. But the words wouldn't come. They never did when it mattered most. Instead, I sat there in my discount store clothes, my hands trembling in my lap, feeling the familiar weight of unworthiness settling over me like a shroud. Maybe she was right. Maybe I didn't deserve anything. Maybe $50,000 was too much for someone who had never quite measured up, who had never quite fit in, who had never quite been enough. However, Mr. Winters said, his voice cutting through the fog of my self-recrimination, there is one additional item. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, and bearing my name in Grandfather's familiar handwriting. My heart began to race, though I couldn't have said why. There was something about the way Mr. Winters held the envelope, something about the sudden stillness that had fallen over the room, that made me feel as though the world was about to shift on its axis. This letter was sealed and witnessed with explicit instructions that it be opened only after the reading of the primary will, he explained, his fingers working carefully at the envelope's seal. It was written entirely in Harold Morrison's own hand, and it is dated just 3 months before his death. I watched, mesmerized, as he withdrew a single sheet of paper, covered in Grandfather's careful script. The handwriting was shakier than I remembered, but unmistakably his. The same careful loops and precise spacing that had appeared on birthday cards and Christmas gifts, and the margins of books he had lent me over the years. "My dearest Emily," Mr. Winters began, his voice taking on the cadence of Grandfather's speech. "If you are hearing this, then I am gone, and I can only hope that you will forgive an old man for the deception I have been forced to practice in these final years of my life." The room seemed to grow smaller, the walls pressing in as Mr. Winters continued to read. I could feel Mother's tension beside me, could sense Catherine's confusion, but all of my attention was focused on the words that seemed to be coming from beyond the grave, from the man who had been my anchor in a world that had never quite made sense. For the past 5 years, I have been aware of certain misrepresentations that have been made to me regarding your character and your circumstances. I have been told that you were irresponsible with money, that you had developed problems with alcohol and drugs, that you had been stealing from your mother and asking for handouts from other family members. I felt the blood drain from my face, my hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that my knuckles went white. Those weren't just misrepresentations. They were outright lies, fabrications so complete and so devastating that they had succeeded in poisoning the most important relationship in my life. I had wondered why Grandfather had grown so distant, why his calls had become less frequent, why he had seemed to look at me with such sadness and disappointment during our last few visits. I believed these stories because they came from someone I trusted, someone who had never given me reason to doubt her word. I allowed them to influence my actions and my decisions, and I withdrew from you at a time when you needed me most. For this, I am deeply sorry. Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and unexpected, carrying with them years of confusion and hurt, and the terrible loneliness of being misunderstood by the person whose opinion mattered most. I had blamed myself for Grandfather's distance, had assumed that I had somehow failed him, had disappointed him in ways I couldn't even identify. The relief of understanding was almost as painful as the years of confusion had been. However, in my final months, I began to investigate these claims more thoroughly. I hired a private investigator to look into your circumstances, and what I discovered filled me with both rage and profound regret. You had not been stealing or asking for handouts. You had been working multiple jobs to support yourself while attending college, and you had never once asked the family for financial assistance. You had not developed problems with substance abuse. You had been volunteering at a local rehabilitation center, helping others overcome their addictions. You had not been irresponsible with money. You had been sending small amounts to various charities, and had been saving every penny you could toward your goal of becoming a writer. The words hit me like a physical force, each revelation more stunning than the last. Someone had been watching me, had been documenting my struggles and my small attempts at making a difference in the world. Someone had cared enough to look beyond the lies and discover the truth of who I really was. Emily, you are not the person I was told you were. You are better than I ever dared to hope, stronger than I ever imagined, and more worthy of love and respect than I ever had the chance to tell you. You are the granddaughter I always wanted, the writer I always believed you could become, and the woman I should have supported and encouraged instead of doubting and avoiding. I was sobbing now, great heaving sobs that shook my entire body and drew stares from everyone in the room. But I didn't care. For the first time in 5 years, I felt seen, understood, valued for who I actually was rather than who I had been portrayed to be. The grandfather I had loved and lost was speaking to me from beyond the grave, offering me the validation and support I had been craving for so long. Therefore, I have made certain arrangements that I believe will better reflect my true wishes and my genuine assessment of your character. Behind the furnace in the basement of the family home, there is a loose stone in the foundation wall. Behind that stone, you will find a fireproof safe. The combination is your birth date, 05/17/1994. Inside that safe, you will find a second will, properly witnessed and notarized, that supersedes the document being read today. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat, could feel the weight of 3 pairs of eyes fixed on me, could sense the shift in the room's energy as the balance of power began to tilt in an entirely new direction. Mother had gone very still beside me, her breathing shallow and controlled in the way that meant she was fighting to maintain her composure. In that second will, you will find that I have left you the family home and the majority of my estate. You will also find the deed to the 200-acre farm that has been in our family for 3 generations, as well as stock certificates for Morrison Industries and the complete collection of Swiss timepieces that you so admired as a child. The total value of these assets is approximately $3.2 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. $3.2 million. It was more money than I had ever imagined, more than I had ever dreamed of having, more than I could have conceived of deserving. But even more than the money, it was the recognition, the acknowledgement, the final proof that I had been worthy of love and trust all along. I have also included a detailed accounting of the lies that were told to me about you, complete with dates and witnesses. I believe you will find this information useful in understanding how you were systematically undermined and excluded from the family that should have embraced and supported you. You will also find letters of recommendation to several literary agencies and publishing houses, as well as a fund specifically designated to support your writing career for the next 5 years. Mr. Winters paused, his eyes moving from the letter to my face and back again. I could see the surprise in his expression, the professional curiosity of a man who had spent his career managing family secrets and unexpected revelations. He had clearly not been aware of the letter's contents, had not been prepared for the bombshell that was about to explode in his carefully ordered office. Emily, I hope you will use this inheritance not just to secure your own future, but to remember that you have always been worthy of love, respect, and support. You have always been enough, exactly as you are. The failure was not yours. It was mine, for believing lies about someone I should have trusted. And it was theirs, for telling those lies in the first place. I looked up through my tears to see Mother's face, and what I saw there chilled me to the bone. Her carefully maintained composure had cracked, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. Her hands were clenched into fists on the table, her knuckles white with tension, her breathing sharp and shallow. She looked like a woman who had been caught in a lie so fundamental that it threatened to destroy everything she had built her life around. I have arranged for Mr. Winters to accompany you to the family home to retrieve the safe and its contents. I have also arranged for legal representation to ensure that this second will is properly executed and that any challenges to its validity are swiftly dealt with. I do not expect this revelation to be received well by certain family members, but I hope you will remember that their anger comes from being exposed, not from any wrongdoing on your part. Catherine was staring at me as though I had suddenly sprouted wings, her mouth slightly open, her eyes wide with shock. Of all the people in the room, she seemed the most genuinely surprised by the revelations, and I realized with a start that she might have been as much a victim of Mother's manipulations as I had been. She had been the golden child, the favored daughter, but perhaps that had been its own kind of prison. Finally, my dear Emily, I want you to know that I am proud of you. I am proud of the woman you have become, the struggles you have overcome, the kindness you have shown to others even when you were struggling yourself. I am proud of your writing, your dreams, your determination to make something meaningful of your life despite the obstacles that have been placed in your path. You are my granddaughter, and you are extraordinary. The letter ended there, but Mr. Winters was not finished. He set the paper aside and reached for another document, this one bearing official seals and signatures. This is a court order, signed by Judge Harrison, authorizing the immediate retrieval of the safe and its contents. It also includes instructions for the verification of the second will and provisions for its immediate execution upon authentication. I felt as though I were floating, as though the ground beneath my feet had disappeared, and I was suspended in a space between one life and another. The woman who had entered this office an hour ago, the woman who had believed she deserved nothing, who had accepted a lifetime of diminishment and dismissal, was gone. In her place was someone I didn't yet recognize, someone who had been given not just an inheritance, but a completely new understanding of her own worth. "This is impossible," Mother said, her voice tight with controlled fury. Harold was confused in his final years. He had dementia. He wasn't competent to make these decisions. Mr. Winters consulted his notes, his expression carefully neutral. The medical records indicate that Harold Morrison was mentally competent at the time this letter was written. He underwent a comprehensive cognitive assessment just 2 weeks before its composition, and the results showed no signs of dementia or cognitive impairment. Additionally, the second will was witnessed by 2 independent parties and notarized by a licensed professional. But the lies, Mother continued, her voice rising despite her efforts to control it. These accusations he's making, these supposed investigations, they're the fantasies of a sick old man. Emily has been what? I asked, my voice stronger than I had expected it to be. Has been working 3 jobs to pay for college? Has been volunteering at the rehab center? Has been sending money to charities? Has been trying to write a novel in her spare time? For the first time in my life, I saw my mother at a loss for words. She stared at me as though I had suddenly become visible to her, as though the woman sitting across from her was someone she had never seen before. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "Because that's what I've been doing," I continued, the words coming more easily now. "That's what I've been doing for the past 5 years, while you've been telling Grandfather that I was stealing from you and asking for handouts and destroying my life with drugs and alcohol. That's what I've been doing, while you've been systematically destroying my relationship with the most important person in my life." "Emily, Why?" The question came out as a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of confusion and hurt. "Why would you do that? Why would you lie about me? Why would you take away the one person who believed in me?" The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of truths that had been hidden for too long. I could see the calculation in Mother's eyes, the desperate search for an explanation that would make sense, that would allow her to maintain some shred of dignity and control. "You were always his favorite," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Even when you were a child, even when you were failing at everything. He always believed in you. He always thought you were special, talented, destined for something great. And I was the one who sacrificed everything for this family. I was the one who gave up my career to raise you and Catherine. I was the one who managed his affairs, who took care of him when he was sick, who made all the difficult decisions. But you were still his favorite. The admission hung in the air between us, raw and painful and honest, in a way that nothing had been for years. I could see the little girl in my mother's eyes, the daughter who had always tried to be perfect, who had always done everything right, who had never understood why love couldn't be earned through achievement and sacrifice. "So, you decided to destroy that," I said, the pieces finally falling into place. "You decided that if you couldn't be his favorite, then I shouldn't be either. I thought if he saw you clearly, if he understood what you really were, what I really was." I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. What I really was someone who loved him. Someone who looked forward to his calls and his visits and his stories. Someone who was trying to make him proud even when I felt like I was failing at everything else. What I really was his granddaughter. And you took that away from both of us. The weight of the revelation was crushing, but it was also liberating. For the first time in my life, I understood the dynamics that had shaped my family. The invisible forces that had determined who was valued and who was dismissed, who was supported and who was sabotaged. I had spent years blaming myself for my mother's coldness, for Catherine's distance, for grandfather's withdrawal. But it hadn't been about me at all. It had been about Mother's own insecurities, her own desperate need to be the center of attention, the most important person in everyone's life. "We need to go to the house," Mr. Winters said gently, breaking the silence that had fallen over the room. "The court order requires that we retrieve the safe and its contents today." I nodded, not trusting my voice. The house, grandfather's house, was about to become my house. The place where I had spent so many happy afternoons listening to stories and learning about the world was about to become my sanctuary, my refuge, my launching pad for the life I had always dreamed of living. "Emily, wait," Catherine said, speaking for the first time since the letter had been read. I need to understand what's happening here. Are you saying that Mother lied about you? That she made up stories about you stealing and using drugs?" I turned to look at my sister, really look at her, and saw something I had never noticed before. Behind the perfect makeup and the designer clothes and the confident facade, there was confusion and hurt, and a dawning realization that the family she had thought she knew was not the family she had actually been living in. "Yes," I said simply. "She made it all up. She told grandfather that I was irresponsible and dishonest, and that I had been asking the family for money. None of it was true." Catherine sat back in her chair, her face pale. "But why would she do that? Because she was jealous," I said, the words coming out more gently than I had expected. "Because grandfather loved me, and she needed to be the only one he loved." "But that's—" Catherine shook her head, her eyes moving from me to Mother and back again. "That's horrible. That's manipulative and cruel and evil. Catherine, you don't understand," Mother said, her voice taking on the pleading tone she had always used when she needed something. "Emily was always difficult. She was always ungrateful. She never appreciated what she had, never tried to fit in with the family. I was trying to protect Harold from disappointment. By lying about me?" I asked. By making up stories about me stealing and using drugs? By systematically destroying my relationship with my grandfather? You're being dramatic, Mother said, but her voice lacked conviction. You're making this sound worse than it was. Am I? I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Should I call the volunteer coordinator at the rehab center and ask her to verify that I've been working there for the past 3 years? Should I call my professors and ask them to confirm that I've been maintaining a 3.8 GPA while working multiple jobs? Should I call the editor of the literary magazine and ask her to verify that I've been published 3 times in the past year? Mother's face crumpled, the carefully maintained facade finally giving way to something raw and desperate. I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant for him to cut you out completely. I just wanted him to see that you weren't perfect, that you weren't the golden child he thought you were. But I was never the golden child, I said, the truth of it hitting me like a physical blow. I was just someone who loved him and wanted to make him proud. I was just someone who needed a grandfather, who believed in me, and you took that away from both of us. The drive to grandfather's house felt like a journey through time, each familiar landmark bringing back memories of the man who had shaped so much of my childhood. The old oak tree where he had taught me to identify different types of leaves. The corner store where he had bought me candy and listened to my stories about school. The small church where he had taken me on Sunday mornings when I was staying with him for the weekend. The house itself looked smaller than I remembered, but no less magical. It was a modest 2-story colonial with white siding and green shutters, surrounded by the gardens that grandfather had tended with such care. The roses were still blooming despite the late season, their petals scattered across the walkway, like confetti from a celebration I had missed. Mr. Winters had brought 2 witnesses, as required by the court order, and they followed us into the house with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this kind of thing before. The basement was exactly as I remembered it, cool and damp and filled with the accumulated treasures of a lifetime. Grandfather's workshop occupied one corner, his tools still hanging on their pegboard, waiting for hands that would never use them again. The furnace stood in the opposite corner, a massive old beast that had been heating the house for decades. Behind it, just as the letter had described, was a section of the foundation wall where one of the stones seemed slightly different from the others. Mr. Winters produced a small crowbar from his toolkit and carefully pried the stone loose, revealing a cavity that had been invisible from the outside. The safe was exactly where Grandfather had said it would be, a small black box that looked utterly ordinary, despite the extraordinary secrets it contained. My hands shook as I entered the combination. My birth date, the date that had marked my entry into the world and into his heart. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the basement and into the future. Inside, carefully wrapped in plastic, were the documents that would change everything. The second will, just as Grandfather had promised, bearing his signature and the signatures of 2 witnesses I didn't recognize. Stock certificates for Morrison Industries, the company he had built from nothing into a regional powerhouse. The deed to the family farm, 200 acres of rolling hills and fertile fields that had been in our family for 3 generations. And at the bottom of the safe, wrapped in soft cloth, was a small leather journal. I opened the journal with trembling hands and found myself looking at years of careful documentation. Dates and times and detailed accounts of every lie Mother had told, every story she had fabricated, every way she had systematically undermined my relationship with Grandfather. It was all there, written in his careful handwriting, a record of deception so complete and so calculated that it took my breath away. But there were other things, too. Copies of my college transcripts, showing the grades I had earned while working multiple jobs. Letters from my professors, describing my work ethic and my potential. Articles I had published in literary magazines, carefully cut out and preserved. Photographs of me volunteering at the rehab center taken by someone who had clearly been documenting my activities without my knowledge. At the very bottom of the journal, in handwriting that grew increasingly shaky toward the end, was a series of entries that made my heart break all over again. Emily called today. She sounded tired but happy. She told me about the story she's working on, about the characters who are starting to feel real to her. I wanted to tell her how proud I am, how much I believe in her talent, but Margaret's words keep echoing in my head. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm being fooled by someone who's become very good at deception? Saw Emily at the grocery store today. She was buying pasta and peanut butter, student food, the kind of meal someone eats when they're working hard and trying to save money. She looked thin, like she's not eating enough. Margaret says she's spending all her money on drugs, but she looked like someone who's sacrificing everything for her education. I'm so confused. The private investigator's report came today. Margaret lied about everything. Emily isn't using drugs. She's volunteering at a rehab center. She isn't stealing. She's working 3 jobs and sending money to charities. She isn't asking for handouts. She's too proud to ask for help even when she needs it. My God, what have I done? The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before his death. I've made arrangements to correct the terrible mistake I've made. Emily is everything I always believed she was. Talented, kind, hardworking, deserving of love and support. I failed her by believing lies about her character. And I failed myself by allowing jealousy and manipulation to poison the most important relationship in my life. I hope she can forgive me. I hope she can understand that my love for her never wavered, even when my faith in her was shaken. I hope she can use this inheritance not just to secure her future, but to remember that she has always been enough. By the time I finished reading, I was crying again. But these tears were different from the ones I had shed in the lawyer's office. These were tears of grief and relief and gratitude. Tears for the grandfather I had lost and found again. Tears for the years of doubt and confusion that were finally over. The legal verification of the second will took place in the same office where my world had been turned upside down just hours earlier. The witnesses confirmed their signatures. The notary verified his seal. And Mr. Winters officially declared the document to be valid and binding. With the stroke of a pen, I went from being the family disappointment to being the primary heir to a fortune I had never imagined. But more than the money, more than the properties and the stocks and the Swiss timepieces, was the knowledge that I had been loved, that I had been seen and valued and believed in by the person whose opinion mattered most to me, that I had been worthy all along, despite the lies that had been told about me, despite the years of doubt and confusion and pain. The next few days passed in a blur of legal proceedings and practical arrangements. I quit my 3 part-time jobs, explaining to my supervisors that I had received an unexpected inheritance. I met with financial advisors and accountants and lawyers, trying to wrap my head around the concept of suddenly having more money than I had ever dreamed of. I started making arrangements to move into grandfather's house, to take possession of the place that had always felt more like home than anywhere else. Catherine called me on the 3rd day, her voice uncertain and subdued. "Emily, I've been thinking about what happened in the lawyer's office, about what Mother did. I need to talk to you." We met at a small cafe downtown, the kind of place where college students spent hours nursing single cups of coffee and working on laptops that had seen better days. Catherine looked different somehow, smaller and more vulnerable without her designer armor. She had chosen a simple sweater and jeans, and her makeup was minimal, almost tentative. "I keep thinking about all the times Mother talked about you," she said, stirring her coffee without drinking it. "All the things she said about you being irresponsible and ungrateful and causing problems for the family. I believed her. I believed everything she said. "She's very convincing," I said, and I meant it. "She's been practicing manipulation for so long that she's become an expert at it." "But I should have known better," Catherine insisted. "I should have seen through it. I should have defended you instead of just accepting what she said." I studied my sister's face, seeing for the first time the guilt and confusion that had been hidden beneath her confident exterior. "Catherine, can I ask you something? Were you happy? Growing up, I mean. Were you happy being the golden child?" She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on her coffee cup. "I thought I was," she said finally. "I thought I was lucky to be the favorite, to be the one who got the attention and the praise and the opportunities. But looking back now, I realized that I was performing all the time. I was trying so hard to be perfect, to live up to the image Mother had created of me, that I never really figured out who I was underneath all of that. And now I'm wondering if I was as much a victim as you were," she said quietly. "If Mother didn't just lie about you, but also created a false image of me. If she didn't just destroy your relationship with Grandfather, but also prevented me from having a real relationship with him. Because I was too busy being perfect to be genuine. The insight hit me like a physical blow. I had spent so many years envying Catherine, resenting her for being the favorite, that I had never considered the possibility that her position in the family had been its own kind of prison. She had been the golden child, but she had also been the one who could never disappoint, never fail, never show weakness or vulnerability or genuine human emotion. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry I didn't see what was happening. I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you. I'm sorry I let Mother turn us against each other instead of finding a way to be allies. We were children," I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. We were both just trying to survive in a family that was more complicated than we understood. "But we're not children anymore," Catherine said, gripping my hand tightly. "We're adults, and we get to choose what kind of relationship we want to have with each other. We get to choose whether we let Mother's manipulation continue to define us, or whether we build something new." That conversation marked the beginning of a new chapter in my relationship with Catherine. We started meeting regularly, talking through the years of misunderstanding and resentment, discovering that we had more in common than we had ever imagined. She was struggling with her own sense of identity, trying to figure out who she was when she wasn't performing perfection for Mother's approval. Moving into Grandfather's house was like stepping into a different version of my life, one where I had always been valued and supported and believed in. Every room held memories of the man who had seen potential in me when no one else had, who had encouraged my dreams when everyone else had dismissed them as impractical fantasies. The house itself seemed to welcome me, as though it had been waiting all these years for me to come home. I set up my writing space in Grandfather's old study, surrounded by the books he had collected over a lifetime, and the antique desk where he had conducted his business affairs. The Swiss timepiece collection occupied a place of honor on the mantelpiece, their intricate faces catching the light from the windows and marking the passage of time with mechanical precision. Each watch told a story of craftsmanship and dedication, of attention to detail and the pursuit of perfection, qualities that Grandfather had tried to instill in me from a young age. The first time I sat down at his desk to write, I felt his presence so strongly that I turned around, half expecting to see him standing in the doorway with that gentle smile that had always made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. Instead, I found a photograph I had never noticed before. A picture of the two of us from my 8th birthday, sitting together on the porch swing, both of us laughing at something that had seemed hilarious at the time. I was gap-toothed and messy-haired, and he was looking at me with an expression of pure delight as though I was the most wonderful thing he had ever seen. The novel I had been carrying around in my head for years began to flow onto the page with an ease that surprised me. The characters who had been whispering in my imagination for so long suddenly found their voices, their stories unfolding with a clarity and purpose that I had never been able to achieve when I was writing in stolen moments between jobs, when I was too tired and too stressed to access the creative space I needed. The story was about a young woman who discovers that her family's history is not what she believed it to be, that the people she trusted had been lying to her about fundamental aspects of her identity. It was about the power of truth to transform lives, about the way lies can poison relationships across generations, about the courage it takes to rebuild yourself when everything you thought you knew turns out to be false. As I wrote, I began to understand that grandfather's gift to me was not just the money or the property or the validation. It was the freedom to become who I had always been, meant to be. For the first time in my life, I didn't have to worry about making rent or paying bills or juggling multiple jobs just to survive. I could focus entirely on my writing, on the stories that were demanding to be told, on the creative work that had always felt like my true calling. The process was both exhilarating and terrifying. I had spent so many years defining myself by my struggles, by my status as the family disappointment, that I hardly knew who I was when those limitations were removed. I had to learn how to occupy space without apologizing for it, how to express opinions without prefacing them with disclaimers, how to dream big without immediately scaling back my expectations. 3 months after the reading of the will, I received a phone call from one of the literary agents grandfather had recommended. She had read the first 3 chapters of my novel and wanted to meet with me to discuss representation. I sat in her Manhattan office, looking out at the city skyline, and felt as though I was living in someone else's life, someone braver and more confident and more deserving of success than I had ever imagined myself to be. "Your writing has a voice that's both intimate and universal," she told me, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "You've managed to capture something essential about the way families shape us, about the stories we tell ourselves, and the stories others tell about us. I think this could be something really special." We talked for 2 hours about the novel, about my vision for the story, about the themes I was exploring, and the characters I was developing. She understood the work in ways that I had never experienced before, saw connections and possibilities that I hadn't even realized were there. When she offered to represent me, I felt as though I was accepting not just a business arrangement, but a validation of everything I had been working toward for so many years. The publishing process was a whirlwind of revisions and consultations, of cover designs and marketing strategies, of interviews and readings and the 1,000 small decisions that go into bringing a book into the world. Through it all, I felt grandfather's presence, his encouragement, his belief in my ability to succeed. The Swiss timepieces on the mantelpiece marked the passage of time as I worked, their steady ticking a reminder that every moment was precious, that every day was an opportunity to create something meaningful. Catherine became my closest ally during this period, reading drafts and offering feedback, celebrating small victories, and providing encouragement during the inevitable moments of doubt and frustration. She had started her own journey of self-discovery, leaving her corporate job to pursue a master's degree in art therapy, finding her own way to help people heal from trauma and dysfunction. "I spent so many years trying to be perfect for Mother," she told me one evening, as we sat on grandfather's porch, watching the sun set over the gardens he had tended with such care. "I never allowed myself to explore what I actually wanted to do with my life. I was too busy being the daughter she wanted me to be. And now I'm learning to be the daughter I want to be," she said, her voice filled with a quiet strength I had never heard before. I'm learning to make choices based on what feels right to me, not what will earn approval from someone else. Mother had largely disappeared from our lives after the truth about her lies was revealed. She had attempted to contest the will, hiring lawyers and making claims about grandfather's mental state. But the evidence of his competency was overwhelming, and her case was dismissed within a matter of weeks. The last I heard, she had moved to another state, claiming she needed a fresh start away from the toxic family dynamics that had been unfairly blamed on her. The irony was not lost on me. Even in defeat, even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of her manipulation and deception, she had found a way to cast herself as the victim, to claim that she was the one who had been wronged. It was a masterpiece of denial and deflection, a final demonstration of the psychological patterns that had shaped our family for so many years. But her absence was a gift in its own way. For the first time in our lives, Catherine and I were able to build a relationship based on honesty and mutual respect, rather than competition and comparison. We were able to explore who we were as individuals and as sisters without the constant pressure to perform for someone who would never be satisfied with our efforts. The novel was published 18 months after that life-changing day in the lawyer's office, and it exceeded every expectation I had dared to hold. The reviews were enthusiastic, the sales were strong, and the response from readers was overwhelming. I received letters from people who had seen themselves in the story, who had recognized their own family dynamics in the characters I had created, who had found hope and healing in the themes I had explored. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. I was doing a reading at a bookstore in the city when I noticed an elderly woman in the back row, her silver hair pulled back in a familiar style, her eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me momentarily lose my place in the text. After the reading, she approached me with a book in her hand. "I'm Margaret Thompson," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years and experience. "I knew your grandfather when we were young. We dated briefly before he met your grandmother." I stared at her, trying to process this connection to a part of grandfather's life I had never known about. "You knew him?" "I did," she said, her eyes soft with memory. "He was a good man, even as a young person. He had a way of seeing the best in people, of believing in their potential even when they couldn't see it themselves. I heard about what happened with your mother, about the lies she told. I wanted you to know that Harold never stopped talking about you, never stopped believing in your writing, even during those difficult years when he was confused about other things." She handed me the book, and I realized it was a copy of my novel. "Would you sign this for me? I'd like to give it to my granddaughter. She's a writer, too, and she's been struggling with her own family issues. I think your story might help her understand that she's not alone." As I signed the book, I felt the circle completing itself. Grandfather's belief in me had led to a story that might help someone else find their own strength, their own voice, their own path to healing. The lies that had been told about me had ultimately led to a truth that could benefit others, a testament to the power of perseverance and the importance of refusing to accept other people's definitions of who we are. The success of the novel opened doors I had never imagined. I was invited to speak at conferences and universities, to share my story with audiences who were hungry for narratives of resilience and transformation. I established a scholarship fund for young writers from difficult family backgrounds, providing them with the support and encouragement that I had always craved. But perhaps the most important change was internal. I learned to occupy space without apologizing for it, to express my opinions without prefacing them with disclaimers, to dream big without immediately scaling back my expectations. I learned to recognize my own worth, to trust my own instincts, to believe in my own potential. The Swiss timepieces on the mantelpiece continued to mark the passage of time, their intricate mechanisms a reminder that every moment was precious, that every day was an opportunity to create something meaningful. I thought often of Grandfather during those first years after his death, of the man who had seen potential in me when no one else had, who had fought to correct the injustices that had been done to me, even from beyond the grave. 5 years after the reading of the will, I published my second novel, a story about forgiveness and redemption that explored the complex relationships between mothers and daughters. The book was dedicated to Grandfather, but it was also, in a way, a tribute to Mother. Not to the woman who had lied and manipulated and tried to destroy my relationship with the person who loved me most, but to the wounded child inside her who had never learned how to love without controlling, how to support without dominating, how to be proud of her children without needing to be the center of their universe. Catherine and I had talked extensively about Mother during those years, trying to understand the forces that had shaped her into the person she had become. We had concluded that she had been a victim of her own insecurities, her own fears of abandonment and inadequacy. That didn't excuse her actions, but it helped us understand them, and understanding had been the first step toward healing. The farmland that Grandfather had left me became a retreat center for writers and artists, a place where creative people could come to work on their projects without the distractions and pressures of daily life. I kept the main house as my primary residence, but I built several small cabins on the property where visiting writers could stay for weeks or months at a time, immersing themselves in their work while surrounded by the natural beauty that had always inspired me. The center attracted writers from all over the country, people who were working on novels and memoirs and poetry collections, people who were struggling with their own family dynamics and personal challenges. I found tremendous satisfaction in providing them with the support and encouragement that I had always craved, in creating a space where creativity could flourish without judgment or competition. One of the most rewarding aspects of running the retreat was the relationships I formed with the writers who came to stay. Many of them were dealing with their own versions of family trauma, their own struggles with feeling worthy of love and success. I was able to share my story with them, to help them understand that their family's opinion of them was not necessarily an accurate reflection of their worth or potential. A young woman named Sarah came to the retreat during its second year of operation. She was working on a memoir about growing up with a narcissistic mother who had systematically undermined her confidence and sabotaged her relationships. Sarah reminded me of myself at that age, talented but insecure, creative but convinced that her dreams were impractical, desperate for validation, but afraid to hope for it. "I feel like I'm writing in circles," she told me during one of our weekly check-ins. "Every time I think I've made progress, I hear my mother's voice in my head telling me that I'm being dramatic, that I'm exaggerating, that no one will want to read about my problems. That's not your voice," I told her, recognizing the pattern of self-doubt that had plagued me for so many years. That's the voice of someone who needed to diminish you in order to feel better about herself. Your story matters. Your experience matters. Your perspective is valuable. Over the course of her residency, I watched Sarah transform from a hesitant, apologetic writer into someone who owned her story and her voice. She finished her memoir and found an agent who believed in her work. More importantly, she learned to trust her own instincts, to value her own experiences, to believe in her own worth. These interactions reminded me daily of the gift that Grandfather had given me. Not just the inheritance, but the knowledge that I was worthy of love and support and encouragement. That knowledge had saved my life in ways that went far beyond the financial security, and I was determined to pass it on to others who were struggling with similar challenges. The Swiss timepieces continued to mark the passage of time, their steady ticking a reminder that every moment was precious, that every day was an opportunity to create something meaningful. I thought often of Grandfather during those years, of the man who had seen potential in me when no one else had, who had fought to correct the injustices that had been done to me, even from beyond the grave. Sometimes when I was working late in his study, I would look up from my writing and feel his presence so strongly that I would turn around, half expecting to see him standing in the doorway with that gentle smile that had always made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. He wasn't there, of course, but his influence was everywhere. In the books that lined the shelves, in the photographs that covered the walls, in the quiet confidence that had finally begun to take root in my heart. 10 years after the reading of the will, I received an unexpected visitor. I was working in the garden, tending to the roses that Grandfather had planted decades earlier, when I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked up to see a woman getting out of a small sedan, her movements hesitant and uncertain. It took me a moment to recognize her. Mother, looking older and frailer than I remembered, her silver hair now completely white, her once proud posture slightly stooped. She stood at the edge of the garden for a long moment, as though she was trying to decide whether to approach me or get back in her car and drive away. Finally, she walked toward me, her steps slow and careful. "Hello, Emily," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mother," I replied, setting down my gardening tools and standing to face her. "I wasn't expecting to see you." "I know," she said, her eyes fixed on the ground between us. "I know I have no right to be here. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. But I needed to see you. I needed to try to explain." We stood there in silence for a long moment, the weight of years and secrets and painful truths hanging between us. She looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile, as though the armor of confidence and control she had always worn had finally cracked beyond repair. "I've been in therapy," she said finally, her voice shaking slightly. "For the past 3 years, I've been trying to understand why I did what I did, why I hurt you and Catherine and Harold. I've been trying to face the truth about myself." I didn't respond immediately. I was studying her face, looking for signs of the manipulation and deception that had characterized so many of our interactions over the years. But what I saw instead was genuine remorse, a kind of devastation that went deeper than embarrassment or regret. "Would you like to sit down?" I asked, gesturing toward the bench that Grandfather had placed under the old oak tree. She nodded gratefully, and we walked together to the bench, settling ourselves at opposite ends with a careful distance between us. The roses bloomed around us, their fragrance filling the air with sweetness and hope. "I was jealous," she said without preamble, her voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her. "I was jealous of your relationship with your grandfather, jealous of the way he looked at you, jealous of the way he believed in you. I had worked so hard to be the perfect daughter, to do everything right, to earn his approval and love. But you didn't have to work for it. You just had to be yourself, and he adored you." The admission hung between us, raw and honest in a way that nothing had been for years. I could see the pain in her eyes, the recognition of the damage she had caused, the understanding of the price she had paid for her jealousy and insecurity. "I convinced myself that I was protecting him," she continued. "I told myself that you were taking advantage of his kindness, that you were manipulating him, that you were going to hurt him or disappoint him. But the truth was, I was the one who was manipulating him. I was the one who was lying. I was the one who was causing pain." "Why now?" I asked. "Why are you telling me this now?" She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the roses that surrounded us. "Because I'm dying," she said finally. "I have cancer. The doctors say I have maybe 6 months, maybe less. And I realized that I couldn't leave this world without trying to make amends, without trying to undo some of the damage I've done. The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I had no idea how to feel about them. This was my mother, the woman who had given birth to me and raised me, who had also systematically undermined my confidence and sabotaged my most important relationship. The woman who had hurt me more deeply than anyone else in my life, who was now facing her own mortality and asking for something I wasn't sure I could give. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I destroyed something precious and irreplaceable. But I needed you to know that I'm sorry. I needed you to know that what I did was wrong, that it came from my own weakness and fear, not from anything you did or didn't do." We sat in silence for a long time, the weight of her words settling between us like stones in still water. I thought about the years of confusion and pain, the damaged relationship with grandfather, the sense of unworthiness that had shadowed so much of my life. I thought about the woman beside me, who had been my first teacher about love and safety and belonging, who had also been my first lesson in betrayal and manipulation. "I have something to show you," I said finally, standing up and walking toward the house. She followed me, her steps slow and uncertain, as though she was afraid I was leading her into some kind of trap. I led her into grandfather's study, where the Swiss timepieces still occupied their place of honor on the mantelpiece. The room was exactly as he had left it, except for the writing desk where I had spent so many hours working on my novels. On the desk was a photograph that I had placed there years earlier, a picture of all of us from Catherine's college graduation, before the lies and secrets had poisoned everything. "He never stopped loving you," I said, pointing to the photograph. "Even after he learned the truth about what you had done, even after he changed his will, he never stopped loving you. He was hurt and disappointed, but he never stopped being your father." She stared at the photograph, her eyes filling with tears. "How do you know that?" "Because he wrote about it in his journal. Because he struggled with the decision to cut you out of his will. Because he hoped, right up until the end, that you would find a way to make things right." The tears spilled over then, running down her cheeks in steady streams. She sank into the chair beside the desk, her shoulders shaking with the force of her grief. I had never seen her cry before, had never seen her show any emotion that wasn't carefully controlled and calculated. "I loved him so much," she whispered. "I loved him. And I destroyed our relationship because I was too scared and too proud to admit that I was jealous of my own daughter. I lost him because I couldn't stand the thought of sharing him." I stood behind her chair, my hands resting on her shoulders, feeling the fragility of her bones beneath my fingers. For the first time in my life, I saw her not as the powerful, controlling woman who had shaped my childhood, but as a frightened, insecure person who had made terrible choices based on her own pain and fear. "You didn't lose him," I said quietly. "You lost his trust. You lost his respect. But you didn't lose his love. He died hoping that you would find a way to heal, that you would find a way to make amends." She looked up at me then, her eyes red with tears, and something that might have been hope. Do you think there's any chance that you could forgive me? Not now. Maybe not ever. But someday." I considered the question carefully, weighing the years of pain against the possibility of healing, the damage that had been done against the potential for redemption. "I think," I said finally, "that forgiveness is a process, not a destination. I think it's something we work toward, not something we achieve all at once." She nodded, understanding the complexity of what I was offering. "I know I can't undo what I did. I know I can't give you back the years with your grandfather that I stole from you. But I want to try to make amends. I want to try to be the mother I should have been all along." "What does that look like to you?" I asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never done it before. I've never tried to love someone without trying to control them, without trying to be the center of their universe. I don't know how to be proud of my children without needing to take credit for their achievements." It was perhaps the most honest thing she had ever said to me, and it opened a door that I had thought was permanently closed. We began to meet regularly during the months that followed, sometimes at the house, sometimes at the hospital where she was receiving treatment. The conversations were difficult and painful, filled with tears and recriminations, and the slow, careful work of trying to understand each other. She told me about her own childhood, about the mother who had been cold and demanding, about the father who had been absent and critical. She told me about the ways she had learned to earn love through achievement and control, about the deep fear of abandonment that had driven so many of her actions. She told me about the loneliness of being the perfect daughter, the exhausting work of maintaining an image that never quite felt real. I told her about the years of confusion and self-doubt, about the way her lies had poisoned my relationship with grandfather, about the long process of learning to trust my own worth and value. I told her about the writing, about the retreat center, about the life I had built from the ashes of the one she had tried to destroy. The conversations were not always easy. There were moments of anger and frustration, moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves, moments when I wondered if genuine healing was possible between us. But there were also moments of connection, moments when I glimpsed the woman she might have been if she had learned different ways of loving, different ways of being in the world. Catherine joined us for many of these conversations, bringing her own perspective and her own pain to the process. She had been carrying her own burden of guilt and confusion, her own questions about the role she had played in the family dynamics that had caused so much damage. Together we began to untangle the web of lies and secrets that had defined our relationships for so many years. Mother died 6 months after that first conversation in the garden, as peacefully as someone facing the consequences of their choices could hope to die. Catherine and I were with her at the end, holding her hands as she slipped away from a world that had been both blessed and cursed by her presence. Her funeral was small, attended by a handful of distant relatives, and a few friends who had known her before the lies and manipulation had isolated her from most of the people in her life. Catherine and I spoke at the service, trying to capture the complexity of the woman who had been both our greatest source of pain and our first teacher about love and family. "She was not a perfect mother," I said, looking out at the small gathering of mourners. "She made choices that caused tremendous pain, that damaged relationships that should have been sources of strength and support. But she was also a woman who was shaped by her own pain, her own fears, her own limited understanding of how to love and be loved. In her final months, she showed us that change is possible, that it's never too late to face the truth about ourselves and our actions. She showed us that even the most damaged relationships can find some measure of healing if both people are willing to do the hard work of honesty and forgiveness." After the funeral, Catherine and I returned to grandfather's house, where the Swiss timepieces continued to mark the passage of time with their steady, reassuring rhythm. We sat in the garden where Mother had made her first halting attempt at reconciliation, surrounded by the roses that bloomed year after year, regardless of the human dramas that played out in their shadow. "Do you think she found peace?" Catherine asked, her voice quiet in the gathering dusk. "I think she found something," I replied. "Maybe not peace exactly, but understanding. Maybe a kind of acceptance of who she was and what she had done. And what about us? Do you think we found peace?" I considered the question carefully, thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment. "I think we found something better than peace," I said finally. I think we found the truth. And the truth, even when it's painful, is always better than the lies we tell ourselves to avoid facing it. The retreat center continued to thrive in the years that followed, attracting writers from all over the world who came to work on their projects and heal from their own family traumas. I published 3 more novels, each one exploring different aspects of the themes that had become central to my work: the power of truth, the possibility of redemption, the complex dynamics of family relationships. But perhaps the most important work I did was the quiet, daily practice of living in truth, of refusing to accept other people's definitions of who I was, of believing in my own worth and potential. The Swiss timepieces on the mantelpiece continued to mark the passage of time, their intricate mechanisms a reminder that every moment was precious, that every day was an opportunity to create something meaningful. I thought often of Grandfather during those years, of the man who had seen potential in me when no one else had, who had fought to correct the injustices that had been done to me, even from beyond the grave. His gift to me had been more than money or property. It had been the knowledge that I was worthy of love and support and encouragement, that I had always been enough, exactly as I was. The story of my family had been one of lies and manipulation, of damaged relationships and missed opportunities. But it had also been a story of redemption and healing, of the possibility of change and growth, of the power of love to transcend even the most difficult circumstances. As I sat in Grandfather's study on the 10th anniversary of his death, surrounded by the books he had collected and the photographs he had treasured, I realized that his final gift to me had been the understanding that we are not defined by the stories others tell about us, but by the stories we choose to tell about ourselves. And the story I had chosen to tell was one of resilience and hope, of the possibility of transformation, of the belief that every person deserves to be loved and valued and supported in their journey toward becoming who they were meant to be. The Swiss timepieces continued to tick, marking the passage of time with their steady, reassuring rhythm. And in that rhythm, I heard the echo of Grandfather's voice, still encouraging me, still believing in me, still reminding me that I was enough, that I had always been enough, that I would always be enough.